I was not looking for the census when I found the gap. I was doing what thousands of family researchers do every year: tracing names, matching dates, cross-checking ship manifests with naturalization papers, trying to pin one family to one place at one moment in time. The work was supposed to be routine. Find them in 1900. Trace them backward to 1,890. Then 1,880. Build the timeline. Verify the arrival. Confirm the household. Move on. Simple. Methodical. Ordinary. Except it was not, because every path backward stopped at the same wall. Before we go any further, subscribe, save this video, and leave a comment telling me where your own family line breaks. Because if you have ever tried to trace an American household through the late 19th century, there is a good chance you have already touched the edge of this silence without realizing how large it really is. Every database, every surname, every immigrant branch, every attempt to bridge the years between 1,880 and 1,900 ended the same way. Not with uncertainty, not with faded handwriting, not with missing local records. With absence on a national scale, the federal record that should have connected one America to the next was removed from the chain. 62,979,766 Americans. Names, addresses, occupations, birthplaces, immigration status, naturalization status, family relationships, literacy, home ownership, Civil War service, children born, children living. On the 1st of June 1890, the United States recorded its people in extraordinary detail, and almost all of that record is gone. The official explanation is familiar. A fire in January 1921 damaged the schedules, and what remained was later destroyed after years of deterioration and bureaucratic neglect. For many historians, that is the end of the story. A tragedy, yes, but still a tragedy explained by incompetence, poor storage, and the indifference of a government that had not yet built a true national archival system. But the deeper you go into the sequence of events, the more unsettling the pattern becomes. Because the 1,890 census was not just another census. It was a threshold document. It captured the United States at a hinge point in its history. Just before the nation, it was the first census processed with Herman Hollerith's electrical tabulating system, the punched card technology that would later feed directly into the corporate line that became IBM. It asked more precise questions about immigration and citizenship than earlier national counts had done. It did not merely ask where a person was born. It asked how long they had been in the United States, whether they were still aliens, whether they had filed first papers, whether they were already naturalized. It asked what language they spoke if English was not their mother tongue. It asked women how many children they had borne and how many were still alive. It identified Union and Confederate veterans. It tracked reading and writing. It separated ownership from tenancy. It built household portraits instead of simple head counts. This was not a rough snapshot. It was a baseline. And the timing made that baseline historically explosive. The 1,890 census is the census that officially declared the American frontier closed. Frederick Jackson Turner would build an entire interpretation of American identity around that moment. By then, Chicago had risen into the ranks of the great cities. Immigration had transformed neighborhoods, labor systems, schools, churches, and politics. Ellis Island would open only a short time later, symbolizing a new era of documented migration and mass entry through official channels. The 1,890 census captured the country at the exact moment before that transition hardened into the modern American story. If you wanted to know who was already here before the next wave accelerated, this was the record. If you wanted to verify how long foreign-born residents had been present, this was the record. If you wanted to reconstruct family structures during the most turbulent decades of industrial growth, this was the record. And then it vanished. On the 10th of January 1921, at roughly 5 in the afternoon, smoke was noticed in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington. The workday was ending. Most employees had gone home. According to the reports, a building fireman named James Foster saw smoke coming through openings around pipes that ran from the boiler room into a file room. He reported it. Fire companies responded. Floors were cut open. Water was poured down into the basement. By late evening, the blaze was under control. That much is not controversial. What matters is where the 1,890 census was being kept. In the same basement area stood a fireproof vault. Other census years were stored inside it. The 1,880 census was protected. The 1,900 census was protected. The 1,910 census was protected. But the 1,890 population schedules were not. They had been left outside the vault, on pine shelves, in an unlocked file room, next to the boiler room, and near a carpenter shop filled with sawdust and wood shavings. That detail changes the emotional weight of the entire event. The key question is no longer merely why there was a fire. Fires happen. The deeper question becomes why the most historically vulnerable and irreplaceable record in the building was stored in the least protected position. Contemporary damage estimates varied. Some reports said around 1/4 of the schedules were destroyed by flames. Others added that much of the remainder was damaged by water and smoke. Yet some descriptions indicate that a significant share survived the fire itself in salvageable or even undamaged condition, if even a fraction of those accounts was accurate. Then millions of individual entries still existed after the flames were out. So what happened next? Not a full emergency rescue. Not a national preservation campaign backed by immediate action. Not systematic photographic copying. Not rapid transcription by teams of clerks. Instead, the damaged schedules sat. They were moved, reboxed, shifted to temporary storage, returned, left to continue deteriorating. Water damage became mold, warping, adhesion, rot. And all the while, historians, genealogists, patriotic organizations, and researchers kept raising the alarm. They understood what had been lost and what might still be saved. The National Genealogical Society objected. The Daughters of the American Revolution protested. Researchers appealed for preservation. Letters were written. Requests were filed. Concern was not absent. It was present for years. What was absent was decisive action. For more than a decade, the record hovered in bureaucratic limbo. Then came the most disturbing part of the sequence. In late 1932, a list of records deemed no longer needed for current government business was prepared for review. On that list, the 1,890 population schedules appeared as disposable material. The Librarian of Congress was asked to identify records worthy of preservation for historical reasons. The 1,890 schedules were not rescued through that review. The paperwork continued forward. Then, in February 1933, while the cornerstone for the new National Archives building was being laid, Congress authorized destruction of the remaining 1,890 census records. That timing has haunted researchers ever since. The building meant to preserve the nation's documentary memory was entering the world at the same moment. One of the most irreplaceable federal records in American history was being condemned, and the record did not merely fade away by accident after that point. What remained was intentionally destroyed. A handwritten notation discovered later in Census Bureau files stated that the remaining schedules were destroyed by the Department of Commerce in 1934, with a parenthetical remark indicating the action was not approved by the geographer. Someone objected inside the system. The objection did not stop the destruction. What survives today is only a fragment, a tiny remnant from a handful of states and the District of Columbia, amounting to a few thousand names from a population of nearly 63 million. That is why the loss still feels different from ordinary archival tragedy, because it did not happen in one instant. It happened in stages. First, the record was placed at risk. Then it was damaged. Then it was neglected. Then preservation was requested. Then assurances were given. Then destruction was authorized. Then the remains were eliminated. At every stage, there was another chance for the chain to break in the opposite direction. Another chance for somebody to decide this record was too valuable to lose. Yet the outcome always moved the same way, toward disappearance. That does not prove a grand hidden plot. It does not, by itself, prove the wilder theories people now attach to the missing census. But it does justify suspicion toward the comforting version of the story that reduces everything to one unlucky fire. Because the fire alone cannot explain the whole arc, and the practical consequences are enormous. For genealogists, the 1890 census created a hard national void between 1,880 and 1,900. That means a family may appear in one place, vanish from federal household-level documentation for 20 years, and then reappear in a transformed state, moved, renamed, expanded, split apart, widowed, naturalized, dead, remarried, urbanized, or dispersed across multiple addresses. The precise bridge is missing. For immigrant families, that gap is even more painful. The late 19th century was one of the great migratory eras in American history. Millions arrived, moved inland, changed occupations, changed languages, changed status, and built new households in crowded neighborhoods and frontier towns alike. The 1,890 census was positioned to capture not only where they lived, but how long they had been in the country, and whether they had entered the citizenship process. Lose that, and you lose the best nationwide checkpoint before the 20th century locks in. For descendants of Civil War veterans, the loss also matters. The 1,890 census included special attention to veterans and widows, linking military memory to aging households at a critical time. For women, the fertility questions offer a rare demographic window into family survival. For urban history, the census would have shown block-by-block realities at the moment cities were swelling beyond anything earlier decades had known. The destruction is not just a genealogical inconvenience. It is the removal of the clearest nationwide portrait of who Americans were in a time of profound transition. And that is where the story becomes emotionally combustible. Once you realize how much the census contained, it becomes difficult not to ask why this one record was allowed to die so completely. Why store it outside the fireproof vault, while other census years remained inside? Why leave it in a room so exposed to boiler heat, smoke pathways, and the force of firefighting water? Why fail to launch an immediate national salvage operation if substantial portions still existed after the fire? Why ignore preservation pressure for years? Why authorize destruction while a new archival age was supposedly beginning? Why does the paper trail itself preserve the trace of internal objection? These are not irrational questions. They are the natural questions produced by the documentary trail. Now, people have used those questions to build much larger claims. Some say the 1,890 census would have exposed a different version of American settlement. Some tie it to stories about missing populations, erased communities, hidden infrastructure, or discontinuities in the official narrative of the late 19th century. Others weave it into broader theories about lost history, vanished reports, and knowledge stripped from public memory during the decades when the United States refashioned itself into a modern industrial state. Those theories go far beyond what the surviving evidence can prove. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The actual documented story is already strange enough without adding anything to it. A census of nearly 63 million people was taken at a pivotal national moment. A fire damaged the records, but did not simply annihilate all of them at once. A significant body of material appears to have survived in some condition. The remains were stored badly and allowed to deteriorate. Repeated calls for preservation were made. The government eventually authorized destruction. The fragments left to us are tiny. The resulting gap still shapes how millions of Americans can or cannot verify their origins. That much is real. And when a government document this central disappears through a chain of choices rather than one isolated catastrophe, it changes how people think about the archive itself. You begin to understand that history is not only what was written down, it is also what was kept, what was copied, what was moved to safety, what was left in damp rooms, what was stamped disposable, and what was fed into silence by procedure. The archive is not neutral. It is survival shaped by decisions. That is why the 1,890 census still matters so much. Not because it guarantees some single forbidden truth waiting behind the curtain, but because its absence shows how vulnerable truth becomes when record-keeping fails at scale. Remove one nationwide baseline and entire branches of memory begin to float free from verification. Families are forced to guess. Communities blur. Migration stories lose their middle chapter. The most important transition point in thousands of American lineages becomes a shadow zone reconstructed from substitutes. City directories, state censuses, tax rolls, church books, cemetery records, naturalization stubs, newspaper notices, land deeds, Researchers do incredible work with those substitutes. But substitutes are not the same as a complete federal household census. And so the question survives even when the paper does not. What was in those missing lines that made the loss feel larger than negligence? Not necessarily something mythical. Not necessarily something sensational. Sometimes the most disruptive thing in history is not a secret civilization or a hidden empire. Sometimes it is something simpler and more powerful. An exact record of ordinary people, taken at the wrong moment for it to disappear. Because ordinary people are how history is anchored. Without them, the past becomes easier to rearrange. A city can change its story if the households are gone. A migration can be simplified if the baseline disappears. A family can be retold if the missing generation cannot answer back. That is why this loss continues to attract suspicion. The number is too large. The timing is too precise. The administrative sequence is too cold. The silence afterward is too complete. If you wanted to make it harder for later generations to verify who was here before a demographic transformation, you could hardly design a more effective gap than the one the United States now lives with between 1,880 and 1,900. Maybe it was incompetence compounded by indifference. Maybe it was bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does when history has no immediate cash value. Maybe it was a failure of imagination by officials who could not understand what future generations would need. All of those are possible. But even the most charitable interpretation ends in the same dark fact. The one record that might have connected old America to emerging modern America was first placed in danger, then left to rot, then officially destroyed. That is not just loss. That is removal through stages. And the consequences are still with us. So the next time someone says the 1,890 census was simply lost, stop on that word. Lost suggests something passive, misplaced, unfortunate, inevitable. This was more than that. It was damaged, neglected, debated, deferred, and finally eliminated. The families remain. The doorways remain. The neighborhoods remain in fragments. The local records still whisper. But the one national ledger that could have said, with unmatched precision, who lived in America at that exact turning point is gone. Not forgotten. Not fully burned. Gone. If this story matters to you, subscribe, share the video, and tell me in the comments where your own line disappears. 1880 to 1900. Immigrant branch, Civil War veteran, city family, rural family, any gap at all. The more stories we compare, the clearer the shape of the silence becomes.